Hello, New Covenant Parish. Good to be with you to look at one more lectionary text as we get ready to celebrate the last Sunday in the church year, Christ the King Sunday. And the gospel text we'll think about today is from Matthew 25, 31 through 46. Jesus delivers us a prophecy here about the final judgment of the nations. And this is a fitting conclusion for this portion of the gospel where all through chapters 24 and 25, Jesus has been offering us eschatological or end-time teachings. And right after this teaching, Matthew will move us into the story of Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection. Now, the news that Christ is coming to judge the nations should take none of us by surprise. I mean, the New Testament talks about this in many places. But how are we supposed to understand this passage, this message? And, maybe the most basic way we can apply this message to our lives is to believe deeply and take seriously the gospel teaching that God is present with us, active around us, paying attention to what's going on, paying attention to how we're living. God has standards. Not everything goes with God. And God promises to judge how we live and how we treat each other in relation to His standards. And Jesus Christ will act as our judge. And just by reading Matthew, much less the rest of the New Testament, we know something about who Jesus is, how He lived, and what we can expect Him to do in God's behalf as we stand in judgment before Him. As God's standards were revealed by Christ, they will also be applied by Christ. And this idea of separating sheep from goats, and this is a hard thing to think about, but it is a notable, prominent, striking part of the Bible's vision and message. I'll say it again, not everything goes with God. Many of our actions and a whole lot of our attitudes don't have any place in God's kingdom. And through the separating judgment of Christ, now, King Jesus, God will make a separation that purifies and cleanses, that establishes what's right and eliminates what's wrong. Now, it's noticeable that in Matthew's gospel, this kind of separation is something that will be done in the future. The present is always seen as a mix of what's right and what's wrong. But the promise someday of a separation should kind of arouse our attention and make us realize the importance of examining our own ways of living before Christ does. And notice one of the most striking things about this story, several striking things about it, but this is really something. It's the standard God uses to make the separation. Notice when you read this, Christ judges the people of all the nations in terms of whether they did or whether they didn't give food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, hospitality to the stranger, clothing to the naked, care to the sick, and comfort to those in prison. Notice also that there's nothing in Christ's list about a profession of faith. And please don't miss this. The last thing the sheep seem to have had is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. They just don't seem to have had one. And I'm going to qualify that. I got to. See, that doesn't mean it's not important to have a personal relationship with Christ. Please don't tell anybody I say it's not. The scene of a final judgment is part of Matthew's total gospel, and there are plenty of other passages that balance this one with all the emphasis on action. The heart of the gospel message is clearly heard in Matthew and the other three gospels, that we're to have a personal relationship to God in Christ by grace. But this parable is a powerful reminder that personal piety is not all that Christ calls for from us, and it's sure not all He expects from us. And think about this when you read the story. Think about how both the sheep and the goats are surprised. The sheep have served Christ without knowing Him, and the goats have known Christ without serving Him. And the surprise in this final judgment scene is that Christ doesn't deal with those who both know and serve Him. I mean, this lesson tells us about the fate of everyone in the world except for active Christians. Two things we can take from this. First, we learn something about the measurement Christ uses to judge those who've never heard of Him. And second, we're taught that just giving lip service to Christ and saying, I believe this or that, is not enough. In this story, Christ means to shock complacent Christians into an active life of service. And the last thing to remember here Last thing is that despite the surprise and the protests of both groups, Christ's judgment stands. Excuses aren't considered. The authority for judgment rests with God and not with us. Although sometimes I know we're greatly tempted to do it, we are never to stand in judgment of another person's relationship with God, my friends. That's God's business. That is not ours. Ever. But our business is to gather this Sunday to give worship and praise to the God we know in Christ our King. And I'm looking forward to being a part of that with you. God bless you. Hope to see you Sunday.